Bronx in New York, where we were focusing to be able to direct the actual proposals. Because I was on the board of a few nonprofits at the time and saw the fact that it's a lot of people like swooping in from people who either have money or free time and being like, hey, you know what you need? It's this thing. And that just felt very not how support and growth should be going in terms of actually helping communities. So yeah, long story short there, EduDAO did not pan out, but it was a great learning experience and was the first time really got into digging in more deeply around governance. So I'll save you the full life story, but you know, after going to grad school, getting a master's in public policy, and then ending up at a bunch of research nonprofits, really excited to actually be working on the industry side and playing around with some of these ideas. So the focus for today is going to be talking a little bit about grants, a little bit about delegation, and then general discussion. Where does this need to be pointed to work? Did this die? Give me 1 second. Sure. Can you try now? There we go. All right, cool. And again, as mentioned, please interrupt me. Like, I would much rather have a discussion with whoever's in the room than just talk at it for the purpose of having a video later. Yeah, it would just be a lot more fun for everyone, I hope. So let's start talking about some grant trends. So in this direction with MetaGov, we have the Grant Innovation Lab, where on the 2024 report, we had around 9 people collaborating, including folks running grant programs and just independent researchers. And we've studied a bunch of different programs. So in the 2023 version, which was our first one, we studied just about a dozen ones, including, you know, like Ethereum's ESP program, Aave Grants DAO, some sunset programs like the initial Polygon program and the Algorand Fund, and Near was technically sunset, and then like research program at Protocol Labs and some others. This QR code is to that original report, and I'll share it again at the end as well. The report that we released this year covered, I think it was around 13 grant programs and 5 tooling companies. And that's also the QR code is going to that report. And this time we really expanded beyond the EVM ecosystem. So you could see just coincidentally by alphabetical order, the whole bottom row is non-EVM, right? We had Solana, we had Rootstock, which is a Bitcoin L2. We have Stellar Community Fund, and their lead was actually one of the co-authors here, and she covered Octant. And yeah, we covered a different Ethereum program. We were able to release, right, as Aave Grants DAO had announced that they're sunsetting, we were able to have kind of a retrospective with 0x Bill from there and cover some of that. And yeah, it was just really great opportunity to both get more folks involved and cover more programs. And yeah, this year we were also able to include different actual tools around granting. We didn't want to cover the grant stacks themselves, but we did want to provide color on certain tools that are very related to granting, such as HATS, Karma Gap, Metric Garden, HyperCerts, Open Source Observer. For folks who don't know, like OSO, Open Source Observer, they're building a lot of public data that's available on grant programs. I think they have something like a 14 terabyte data collection already of all the publicly available information, and we're working on some efforts to help them grow that. And then, yeah, like HyperCerts are all about impact markets and how you can generate those. Metric Garden is about creating webs of attestations around projects that actually happen. So, you know, if you got a grant and you promised to do, you know, research on a thing, or like, let's say we got a grant to produce this report, the whole idea of using Metric Garden is everyone who interacts with that report can actually use EAS to attest to it, and then you can develop this actual web of interaction, understand, and get closer to realizing its impact. And then a tool like Karma Gap is all about accountability on the committed outputs. So as part of a grant, you know, you promised to do some stuff. Well, how does anyone track that, right? Ideally, whoever's issuing the grant has people following up. In case you're new to granting in Web3, you will probably be shocked by the amount of groups that don't actively follow and don't have basic norms and best practices, you know, from the non-Web3 world. So yeah, it's just really interesting to see these tools. And I imagine next year when we cover this, there'll probably be 10 times more tools out there. So for those folks who just joined, I will stress that as I'm going through this, please interrupt. Like this, I love having discussions much more than I love just presenting. So yeah, if at any point you have a question, would love you to raise your hand and we'll talk about it. So one of the more interesting parts as we do this, and I'm actually genuinely still frustrated by the fact that like I can't just give you a neat little chart that gives you all the data because all this data is stored in different places. A lot of groups don't like sharing it, so it's actually a huge pain in the butt to get that data. And I'll share a little bit more around DAO IP5 or the grant metadata standard that we're working on through MetaGov and DAOstar. And actually it was part of the Funding the Commons Design Jam that was going on earlier this week. But I mean, you'll see here just in terms of the overall numbers that we're talking about with Web3 grants, we covered, I mean, this State of Web3 grants. So this is between the two reports. So 20 plus grant programs alone have shipped more than $1 billion in 4 to 5 years. And, you know, that's not including like OP's dedicated 850 million OP. That's not yet shipped. They've only shipped, I think, around like 60-ish million of it, but that's what they have dedicated. That's what they've committed to grants, right? Depending on the price of OP, that is a multi-billion dollar fund, right? Arbitrum has already shipped 70 plus million US dollar value of grants, right? So there's a chance that collectively as an industry, we're getting to the ballpark of $5 billion-ish spent on grants. If we're not there yet, we probably will be in a year or two. And if you ask anyone who's shipped any of that money, can you please show me the impact and like give me data and numbers and theories and models, aside from like optimism that's probably done the most work in quantifying this. And even if you talk to Jonas or anyone else there, they will still say there's a lot more to be done. But if you ask most folks, they're like, I don't know, that place was good, right? Like one of the projects that we covered, I don't remember if he said this on the record, so I'm not going to call out which program, but someone that had a $100 million program, they ran it over a year or 2 years, and then we asked him, like, how do you think it went? He's like, honestly, I could have taken 95 of those $1 million, set it on fire in my backyard, and it probably would have been more impactful because at least I would have been warm for like 20 minutes. So I just give you a sense of like how little thought goes into the infrastructure around impact, right? And that's a huge problem. And the fact that we are not clear on what exactly are we spending money on, why are we spending it, right? Just because they did is not a good response. So like the fact that there's a lot of competitive energy around just jumping into shipping grants is a huge red herring and a waste of money. And like, please just go donate that money to nonprofits that actually need it. You will have more impact in the world if you do that, if you don't have a strategy. Yep, please.
Given we're in a really early stage ecosystem as a whole, is the 95 mil that would have been better burned off due to just startups just not surviving 99% of them anyway on average?
I mean, I think that's giving a reasonable look at it. I think that's a fair way to put it. More broadly, I think it's just, right, like when you're building a startup, you kind of have to do whatever you need to do to survive is a lot of the mentality. And in this nascent space, right, like Bitcoin white paper was, 15-ish years ago, 16 years ago now. We're still super new, right? Like AI seems new. That started in the 50s and had decades of like background development before it actually started hitting mainstream, right? So in my own opinion, and I feel like I've been saying the same exact sentence for like 7 years now, but I still think in like the development cycle of taking the comparison to the internet, we've laid out TCP IP. We're not at the .com bubble yet. We've just somehow managed to like have a bunch of bubbles in between while we're just laying out the pipes, right? So if you ask anyone of your relatives anyone here, if you ask your relatives to like actually use crypto, they're like step one, like getting on a MetaMask is probably enough barrier to entry for them, right? So just like the UX, UI, like all these, there's so many problems to solve. And startups just want to do something and like try things. So I also think a lot of the spending is just because like, hey, we have this magic internet money that we just made up and we're kind of sitting on millions or billions of dollars. Why not fund the ecosystem? So I think part of the challenge with grants is that like VC investment, granting, public goods, community support funds, audit support funds, these should not all be in a single grant program, which is why one of the takeaways I'm going to get to is the fact of like we're trending towards pluralistic grant programs, having multiple grant programs to service different needs. And even that will be a sliver of the full grant allocation strategy map, right? The landscape of how you give money should be different. if you are funding for-profit projects, you should not be giving them the 17th round grant. That does not make sense anymore. They are a for-profit entity building. They need VC investment or token swaps or something like that, right? If you're focusing on helping a community effort, yeah, that could make much more sense to like give a grant for an event like this, right? And especially just in general, there's a lot of talk about public goods funding in Web3. I would argue almost all of it is network goods, as Juan Benet and the crew at Protocol Labs talk about it, right? Like we're like for Scroll, let's say, and we're new, we haven't had grants yet like this in volume, so this doesn't fully apply to us, but for many programs, it's like, well, I'm really funding the things to make my ecosystem flourish, right? There aren't that many groups that are actually funding like core Ethereum flourishing or core Web3 flourishing, or even just like, I want to see someone create an artist in residency program where it's like, hey, we don't want you to use Web3 at all. Just like go create art with the ethos of decentralization. Like show people what it means. I was actually sad that the person who said they had a psych background from the previous talk left, because I think one of the things that's missing most is like actual understandings of human behavior. Because like I have a lot of thoughts and theories about what it means to be an autonomous individual, and then you show up at a DAO and you have bags of money potentially hanging around in front of you if you act certain ways, and that can subvert that. So anyway, yeah, so with the data side and money, there's just so much room for improvement there. And that is something that we're working on, and I'm definitely very happy to talk about. So let's get into some actual takeaways and trends, both takeaways from the report and general trends that we're seeing. So the ones we'll broadly touch on involve mechanisms, impact, which I'll talk about that a little more, and community, and a few others that didn't fit into those buckets. On the mechanism side, prospective grants, so I give you money for you to go do a thing, that is still the most popular model. There's a lot of pros and cons to that, with I think the biggest one actually being more from the mindset about granting, right? Philanthropic grants or government grants, effectively no string attached for you to kind of go accomplish a thing, but they're not going to hold your feet to the fire in the same way if you don't. Especially, it's like, why didn't TVL go up from that grant, right? Like the parallels to that kind of funding outside of Web3 don't actually clearly port as well. So again, there's just a lot of mixed thinking about it. As opposed to just calling it what it is. If you want it to be VC funding, great, just call it VC funding and you have much better comparables to pull from, and then you can actually be much more productive with what you accomplish. We're also seeing more staged funding. So the days of like, hey, you want a 50K grant, where do I give you all 50K today? That's yesteryears. Very few programs still do that. At the very least, they'll give you at the start and at the finish, though a lot of them, especially as ticket sizes go above like the 50K in certain ecosystems, 100K in others, but multiple milestones and actual verification of milestones before your next tranche of funding is issued. It's also really interesting to see, I've talked to at least one foundation that explicitly says, we will work with the team to set up borderline unrealistic milestones. Not the first one. They obviously want the first one to succeed, but then like 2, 3, 4, in terms of like milestone 2, 3, 4, they're going to keep setting more and more ambitious. Because they're pretty much saying of like, well, if you're just doing the bare minimum and coasting, right, like maybe it's just time to pivot to a different funding model or something. But if you want that second grant, like you really have to outperform. I think that's interesting. That could work well in some places. You know, if it's like research funding, that I would find that a little less clear of how that sits well there. But yeah, nonetheless, there's more thinking about the actual mechanisms, right? We've seen like Optimism kind of laid the groundwork for doing retroactive funding. We actually had a separate report that was 3 case studies on retroactive funding programs. We covered DAO Drops, Optimism rounds 1 through 3, and Gitcoin Citizen rounds 1 through 3. And yeah, now I think since we worked on that report, there's been like Filecoin, and I'm forgetting all the others. I think 5 or 6 other groups have ran, mostly using the Gitcoin XYZ retro stack. Right, I think I butchered the name, but like the Gitcoin product for it. And yeah, we're just seeing more experiments, which I think is really good. Oh, today's Friday. I missed. Oh no, yes, I don't know. But at Funding the Commons, like Owaki just had his book launch on mechanisms, and I think that there's a lot more writing and a lot more ideas for people to pull from of how you could structure really non-traditional grant programs. And I think it's important to think about like why are we shipping money in the first place, right? What is the mission and vision for which we are trying to accomplish with deploying this capital? And then from there, you can start picking, well, if it's to grow community in a holistic way, the way you want to support that community might be very different than if it is more VC style ecosystem growth. So I'm really excited to see more experimentation with the actual mechanism choice selection. And then, with Plurality, I think like Plurality Labs that I ended up getting bought out by Thrive Protocol, they were the first to like really push for that in the Arbitrum ecosystem. And for anyone who like follows Arb, you've seen one flavor of pluralistic grants. And we're seeing more and more groups work towards that. Right. And so like plurality, right, having multiple viewpoints around a single thing, here the idea is that again, the way you invest in nurturing local communities is going to be different than how you try to grow your TVL, is going to be different than getting new use cases, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm really excited. I know for Scroll DAO, as we're starting to think about these questions, and we're currently going through a co-creation cycle for our governance. So how can we design with the delegates and with our community that wants to be active? How can we actually design together the first proposals that we create? As we're going through that process, I'm really excited to see what are the flavors of programs that we want, right? What do we want them to accomplish? Then create a separate mapping of all the mechanisms, and then picking and choosing which mechanisms are going to make sense for the things that we want to accomplish. And again, just a reminder for anyone else joining, please feel free to interrupt me with questions as we're going. Like there's Q&A at the end, but yeah, I always have more fun talking to people than at people. The big thing on the sort of impact side, which is how it's generally slung around, and I actually think impact is probably the most misused term in Web3. What most people mean when they say impact isn't actually impact. What most grant programs mean when they say impact is a combination of output, outcomes, and impact, right? So this is pulling from program evaluation models. If you're interested in this world, like the Kellogg Handbook on it is just like a beautiful resource in this direction. Follow up with me later if you want to link to it. But basically, it's the whole idea that, right, you have resources, you channel those resources to fund specific activities. Those activities then produce an output. People interact with that output and generate outcomes, and then that playing out over years has impact. So to make it more concrete, a DAO has money, or a foundation, or whoever's running a grant program. They decide that they want to go fund new DEXs getting built on their protocol. So they want to fund the development, right? The activity is dev. And then the output is the creation of that DEX. People then interact with that DEX. That's the output is, the outcome is how is people's experience with interacting with it and how is that affecting your protocol? And then the eventual impact is how is the world actually different because all this happened, right? You could have had a lot of activity, but then you look at it and you have 20 DEXs and actually that one's pretty insignificant. So was it actually impactful? Right? And there's no easy way to chop that down. In this arbitrary example, right, well, maybe now they're not relevant 10 years in, but they were the first, and they were the one that showed that it was possible, and then everyone else came, right? So it's actually really hard to quantify impact. And for those who might have been at Funding the Commons yesterday, there were a bunch of great discussions on it. And, there are some people that are intensely in the camp that everything is quantifiable. You just have to find the right way to capture it. And then there's the more subjective camp that, at best, metrics and measurements are always approximations. And there's actually a big danger that your metric becomes your goal. And if you are overly reliant on hitting like TVL growth, then everything could just get optimized towards making that a blip, and then it all disappears as soon as money goes bye-bye, and then are you actually better off? So being really clear on, again, what you want to accomplish, right? What is the eventual impact that you want, and thinking about how you can measure it, and then backing into like what are the things that you want to fund to make that happen. It's a much more arduous route. It takes a lot more time and overhead, but it will save you a ton of energy in the long run, right? A lot of the time grant programs get started where it's like someone on the team, it's like their 17th job internally. You are not going to be happy with the outcomes of your grant program, right? Like you need someone actually dedicated to it, even if you're shipping pretty small amounts, just because like ops is a pain in the butt, structuring it correctly, visioning it, designing it correctly, pulling in the right people, building the review structures. Like it's a long process. It's not straightforward, which is why it ends up being so hard, right? And it's important to keep in mind that, right, there are organizations that have been continuously granting now for over a century, outside of Web3, of course. You talk to the people who are running like Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, government grants, et cetera. All of them say like, we don't actually know what we're doing if you have an honest conversation. Like we're just doing the best that we can. Just they've had decades of iteration to get closer to their own goals, right? And like Web3 is still finding itself in this world. And so on that regard, like a lot of accountability challenges exist, especially grant teams are frequently under-resourced relative to other areas. There's no one actually holding all the grantees accountable. Like I know I've been on the winning side of grants where like we win a grant, it just gets shipped to a wallet. They didn't even tell us. I just randomly checked and then the money's already there. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, like when do you want to report or should I check in from someone? And they're like, you'll hear from us when you hear from us. And like, that's just not helpful to anyone in the process, right? So like actually creating meaningful accountability structures is really important. And now we're seeing tools like Karma Gap evolve where, you know, you can publicly report. So folks that are using like Gitcoin rounds, I think, I'm forgetting which other DAOs are using, so I don't want to accidentally misquote. But there are more and more places that say, hey, please go fill out your Gap profile and update your profile there if you want that next round of funding. So I think more of that accountability on the progress of grants is really important. And, you know, as I was showing the different grant tooling, especially in the context of outcomes, outputs, and impact, we need such better infrastructure, right? To understand what is the impact. Like, let's think about this event that we're at today. Is everyone having a good time? Should we do a quick round of applause for all the organizers and just how great the event's been? Exactly. Right, this has been such a great event. I know I've had a chance to like meet colleagues who I've only talked with online, and I've only had a chance to like meet a bunch of delegates who I've never met in person yet, and just like make new friends and see old friends, and that's all awesome, right? But where is, like, if someone asks you a year from now, what is the impact of today's event? It's really hard to say, right? A, we don't remember, right? I'm probably going to forget in 2 days what I was doing here already just because the amount of other stuff happening around this week, right? And then just so many things happen and it's such a subjective journey. Like someone can just tell me one sentence today that fundamentally changes how I think about governance, right? Like I know I've been part of these conversations throughout my life. They're not regular, but they do happen. And so like when you have those changing, like, do I then go log in on a tool and say that person just changed the way? No, right? Like there's no infrastructure. And even if there was, there's no actual easy ways or culture or norms around doing these things, whether it's celebrating, whether it's just propping up and all these things. So I think we have a lot of room for improvement on the tools, and I'm really excited to see these initial tools come out because that will get us closer to, well, what are better ones? Because until you try the first thing, you don't actually know what's not working or what's missing. And, you know, coming back to the grant data that we were talking about before, right, better standards are needed. And I know I was talking with a few folks, right, there's like the optimism, or they don't publish it that way, but like optimism has its own standard around grants. We just developed that MetaGov and DAO Star. I guess it's been like a year and a half now, but thanks to Rashmi and Josh, who I'm not sure is here today, and others, we've been working a lot on actually improving the metadata standards. And we don't necessarily need like one to rule them all. It's okay if there's a plurality of standards, because if at least there's 1 or 3 or 5 or some manageable amount, right, we can build infrastructure, say into Open Source Observer, where every grant program that has publicly available information, it ends up in a single repository, right? So like in that regard, my hope is that in a year from now, where anyone from the Grant Innovation Lab is giving a presentation on grants, they could show the one neat chart or dashboard that actually talks about all the public grant programs and where we're at. So like that is not a fantasy, that is a tangible thing that many of us are working on, that I'm very hopeful for a year from now, we will have a very meaningful, hopefully sooner, but at least by then we will have a very meaningful tool, right? And we just need more of these kinds of things. More of these actual public goods that benefit everyone around the space who's interested in a single domain. The other side, one of the other general areas of takeaways from the grant report was around community. And specifically in the context of non-financial support, or more broadly, as I think of it, of systems of support, right? If you've ever won a grant, especially in the Web3 context, I'm guessing, like I've been with all my grants, you're very appreciative that you got the money, you needed it to do something, you wouldn't have been able to do that thing without the money. But then especially the more complicated the thing that you're doing, you might say like, hey, money's great, but like, can I go talk to your devs for an hour? Can you help me get an audit? I'm a dev, I have no clue how to market a thing. Or I'm a marketer, I have no clue how to develop a thing. Like, can you actually connect me to other people in your ecosystem who are thinking about these elements, right? We're seeing more of a trend of a few ecosystems have accelerators now, like Octant just ran their program. I know Cardano has been doing one for a while. There are a few others that I'm blanking on at the moment. So like we're seeing different types of approaches, but again, this isn't an area where there's going to be a one size fits all for every community, but we need to just have more experiments. Then we need to map all of the experiments and see how each one of them is going. And then we're going to have better and better data to start building these kinds of systems. So I'm very excited to both kind of have this discussion with our community around the DAO, and we're already starting this and understanding what else does our community actually need to flourish, and how do we then provide that, whether from the foundation or from the DAO. And this is a long and ongoing thing, right? Something can be useful today that won't be useful a year from now, and that's why you always need to be evolving from that perspective. And then communication and engagement, right? So many grant programs, coming back to just like the overhead challenges, so many grant programs don't actually do a great job of publicly saying who they funded. Right, or even like I know at MetaGov, we haven't always done a great job being like, hey, here are all the groups that fund us. So if you come to us and you have no clue who we are and you're not sure whether or not we're reputable, but you trust Ethereum Foundation, well, then you should trust us because they've given us money or something like that, right? And on the flip side, right, if you're a new startup company or project or something like that, to get to say that like, hey, Cardano Foundation or Definity Foundation or Scroll Foundation or whoever, or the DAOs, gave us money, that actually can go a really far way to adding legitimacy to you as a new project, right? And so like that could just be a norm of, hey, if we are granting you money, we are going to publish it here. You can use your logo at the bottom of your website, right? Like that's not a huge ask, but that can be a commitment in each way where that brings together the funder and the fundee closer, that can have better results. And then, yeah, just the challenges with reviewing. Because I think for anyone, especially if you've ever been on the granting side of things, or maybe, I don't know if this is just my own experience, but I'm pretty sure this is not unique. But once you get to the point of like, oh no, wait, I'm supposed to now review the 100 things that we got and I make a choice on these, like it just feels like an intimidating amount of responsibility. I've been in environments outside of Web3 where it's literally just like, I thought I was the part-time person on this. How am I making this call? Like, I'm not qualified to do this, but I'm the one with the most time because I'm the junior person on the team. So I guess I'm making these calls now, right? So it's like the reality of how these things roll out, it's not fully professionalized, right? We could look at, say, Optimism and badge holders, right? Very different structure. It's meant to be open. You're meant to pull in. They're trying to create better structures towards like metrics, impact. And I really respect what the Optimism team is doing. But nonetheless, right, badge holders will all complain of like, well, if I'm a dev, why am I voting on community stuff? I don't know apples from oranges there. If I'm a marketing person, I have nothing to say about the nuances of this coding language being developed or anything like that. So creating actual matching the people with the right knowledge sets and wanting to provide input with the things that they should provide input on is actually a harder problem than many people who design grant programs realize at the outset. And, you know, it's exciting to hear about things like review DAOs or review protocols and like, let's incentivize all the reviewers in the world. And I mean, those things might work, right? I don't want to be too much of a pessimist because we don't have enough data yet. But I think we just don't know what are the best and most realistic structures. And I think we could look at something like scientific peer review for anyone who might come from that world and have had the wonderful joys of interacting with it. Right, like the theory of it is if like I just released a computer science paper, that other computer scientists at my level are the ones reviewing it. They can't be too close to me or have partnered with me. So it's like, you know, finding the right set is its own interesting challenge, especially as we have like imagine a crypto economics paper. There aren't that many crypto economists, right? Like that's not an existing profession that has been around forever. So right now a paper might actually need 7 different skill sets to review it appropriately. But the fun reality is that the grad student or the professor will give it to the PhD who gives it to the master student all within one lab, and it's the master student most likely doing the review. Right. Whereas like the professor who's tasked with it is paid a tenured salary, and the master student is effectively free labor while they're getting their degree. Right. So like most review structures are immensely inefficient and a lot of the time highly exploitative. So actually building a system that works well and produces the desired outcomes where everyone involved in it is happy is just an open question across all domains. So I'm really excited that it feels like there's more energy to experiment with this because we definitely need it. And I'll just reiterate again, sorry you have to keep hearing this if you've been here from the beginning, but I always prefer more discussion, so like do feel free to just interrupt me with a hand at any point. We also had a couple of takeaways and trends that we're seeing that sort of didn't fit into the other buckets. The first one that I mentioned is already adapting to needs, right? As was brought up before, like a lot of startups, they're figuring themselves out, right? Like startup and pivot are a word that go very well together because you start out with one idea, you realize it's not the way to go, you go somewhere else. In this regard, when you're doing a grant program, again, your goals should develop and get more nuanced as you're issuing capital, right? If you're actually tracking where all your grants are going and what are the outcomes and impacts of that money, you're going to realize that some of it was not well spent. So you shouldn't keep doing the same thing, right? You should be learning and revising and adjusting. And everyone who's been in crypto, the entire audience here, you know that, like a year in the regular world can feel like a decade in crypto, right? So things change so quickly here. And especially in those environments, what worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. So you always have to be willing to not be so hubristic to think that you unquestionably know the right thing, right? Read the room, learn from the people around you. And on the other side, just be ready to say like, hey, what we did was dumb and not great. And like, we're just going to start anew. And even if it's painful from a personal ego, whatever perspective, it's going to work much better in the long run if you do the thing to serve your ecosystem, right? Because all these ecosystems are built of people. They are constituted by human beings who actually have desires, needs, etc. And if you're servicing them the right way and like really listening and hearing people, then we can all grow together, which is not usually stated outcomes, but important nonetheless. As mentioned, the communication and documentation challenges is really important. You'd be shocked the amount of times you go to a grant manager and you're like, hey, can we talk about all the grants you've issued? And they're like, yeah, I can talk about the like last 3 months. It's like, oh, well, can you tell me about like the first 10 grants you issued 2 years ago? They're like, oh, that was like 3 people ago. We have no clue what happened there. And so just like institutional knowledge and memory and systems, right? I'm sure especially if anyone's had a job outside of Web3, you've heard of CRMs, right? Customer relation management software. CRMs are not a norm for grant programs yet, nor is any kind of tracking tooling, right? So these things are just like foundational struggles still. And so we just need to come up with better ways to document and share this information. And I feel like I talked on the grant infrastructure side, so I don't want to belabor that point. And so now I'll switch over to delegation. I guess before I do that, any quick questions on the grant side or anything? Yeah.
So you mentioned that some grants programs got sunsetted, like Near and Polygon and others. So what was the reason for their sunsetting?
Yeah, and to be clear, I guess I didn't add the appropriate nuance. So like say for Near, it's not that they have stopped granting in any way, shape, or form. It's that a grant program that they launched, that specific thing got shut down. All right, so like the Protocol Labs program that we covered was actually sunset because they just realized that, hey, this research grant program isn't accomplishing what we need, so we're just gonna put it away, right? For Algorand, I just thought like they weren't pleased with the outcomes and they felt like they couldn't measure it, and so they couldn't justify spending the same amount of money again. For Aave grants now, I wasn't the one who wrote that section up, and I want to unpack it a little more because in my mind, they were one of the more efficient, focused, lean programs that was actually working really well for their stated and desired outcomes. And yet the community decided to sunset it. And I haven't had a chance to catch up with 0x Bill or anyone, but like I'm excited to better understand what changed their mind to feel less relevant.
I want to add to what you're saying. I just wanted to say that one of the, Eugene, yesterday and past 2 days I've spent reading all the papers that Grant Innovations Lab put out. So I wanted to add on to what Eugene was saying was one of the reasons that some of the programs were sunset was because of grant farming. They realized that there's so much grant farming going on where some projects who received grants in one ecosystem, when they didn't complete their milestones, they went to other ecosystem and they were applying for grants, and they sometimes did receive grants, and they still weren't able to produce outcomes. Well, at that time, I think right now there's no coordinated way for grant systems to know what's happening in other ecosystems. That's why, again, shilling the IP5. So, yeah, just adding to what Eugene was saying. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and shameless plug, Rashmi is the technical lead on the DAO IP5 grant metadata standard. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, please feel free to talk to her or me after. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's just some version of we can't justify how we're spending the money. And even in Arbitrum DAO, they didn't sunset their grant program per se, and they didn't have a single grant program, right? But even as a DAO, they realized like, hey, we probably came out a little too hot with the whole granting thing, and we should cool down and figure out our priorities and where we're trying to go with it. So it can be for a mix of reasons. So again, if anyone else has questions, feel free to jump in there. Otherwise, I'm just going to truck along to the delegation side because I think I have like 10-ish minutes left. So I want to touch on a couple questions with why do we delegate, some stats around delegation, the rise of professional delegates, what are some of the challenges, and kind of where can we be heading from here. So in terms of delegation, 5 minutes? Cool. Yeah, so I'll go quick on this side. But basically, right, delegation, initially a lot of one token, one vote. That was the idea of like direct democracy. Everyone gets to vote on everything. Delegation is more representative democracy. I don't have time to vote on everything. I'm going to vote on an elected official who supposedly has time to vote on everything. And that's kind of the structure we're in now with a lot of DAOs. And so, yeah, so in terms of that side, there's some benefits to it of like creating more specialization, right? We have some delegates that we're talking to at Scroll right now who are individuals and some that are big teams, right? Obviously, as a team, it's going to be easier for you to find time to be involved in stuff. Whereas if you are one person trying to be active in multiple DAOs and you have a job and you have a life, you can probably only give so many hours a week to whatever protocol you're on. So yeah, I think that does bring a question of like, are we just going to see mainly professional delegates within a few years? That it's just these structures that have more energy for it. And I want to give some like generic, I generally didn't want to call out anyone, though I did kind of want to give ZK Sync a recognition here because I didn't want to unpack that with their team, but they had a bit of an outlier number there, so which is interesting to see. But again, this is also another area where there's not great collated data yet. So this hopefully in the future, one of the efforts I'm trying to work on is to actually get more research and data coordination around these topics. So if you're interested in all this stuff, please talk to me later. But long story short, total votable supply. So whatever is the proportion of tokens you have out there, the amount that is actively delegated to someone today. For L2s, it's mostly in the 1% to 4% range. So yeah, the fact like ZK Sync has their 12.5, I have no clue how that happened, but that is not a usual number that you see. For the DeFi projects, and a lot of them have been around a little longer. I candidly didn't look at the newer DeFi protocols, but for like the Uniswaps, the compounds, etc., 20+% delegation, right? Because also like think about who owns which type, right? If you're new to crypto, you might buy an OP token. If you're new to crypto and don't know what things are, you're probably not buying like DeFi specific application tokens yet. You might start with the L1s, L2s, more general use cases. And then looking at top delegates, so what percentage of the total votable, the total supply do the top delegates control? And I realize these numbers can look a little muddy. So this bottom number here is for a lot of these ecosystems, the top 20 as a percentage of the actual votable supply. There are some ecosystems where the top 20 have 70% of the entire delegated amount. Right? Decentralized governance at its finest. So I think we also have to be aware of like, what does this actually mean? How do we structure, right? This comes down to like airdrop questions. What is your token allocation strategy? How are you building the community of who that goes to in the first place? Yeah. So, oh, that's all good. So yeah, I want to quickly touch on professional delegates, right? The whole idea, it's more than one person. They can provide more energy and focus on it. I gave like, from a comparison, I always think of it of, you know, like I live in DC in the States. The mayor there is an elected official representing me, supposedly. What if they were a mayor in New York and London and Bangkok? I would probably have much less faith in them, right? But actually for where crypto is at, it's a benefit right now. I don't think it would be sustainable without it. But as we normalize incentivization programs, I think we might actually end up also seeing the rise of delegated ecosystem delegates. Dedicated ecosystem delegates. So if there's a clear enough pathway to get incentivized as a delegate, and I'm okay with that level of compensation for my monthly salary, I could just maybe be a delegate in DAO X, and like that's my life. Is that like I'm a professional politician there? So yeah, that's generally one potential trend in that direction. Oh, nice. And I think in general, there's always the question of incentive alignment. So if you look at a lot of the major DAOs, and I know I'm already starting to experience this, so happy to share more in a couple months once things play out. But incentive alignment, right? You have people coming in and being like, hey, we should build a $1 billion VC. Oh, and did I mention that I should be the one doing it? And we should get a 2% management fee on all the funds flowing through it. So I know for Scroll now, I am very much trying to encourage, like when you write a proposal, imagine it's the foundation running it, right? We're probably not going to run the majority of things because like we're a small foundation, but let's separate the idea from the execution, right? Like let's separate and let the best ideas win based on their merit, and then we will do selection of who is the best group to run that idea, right? So I think right now those two are very conflated in the space. And expertise is not always a given, right? Like I've already been in conversations, whether in our DAO or others, where people are like, hey, you know what? You need a VC fund. And the person pitching me or pitching the other DAO has never worked at a VC or an investment, or like they read a couple blog posts and heard a couple podcasts, and now they feel like they're ready to compete with the big hedge funds, right? And it's like, or VC firms. And it's like, sure, but probably not. And chances are it's not going to go well. So like, we're definitely not giving you $100 million to start. That's definitely a no-no. So I think there's still this like incentive and skill set misalignments with the needs. In terms of where we're headed, I think we need a better understanding of the current state. This is something that we're already talking to a few research groups about, doing some really light research. But I think this, hopefully we will be kicking off, especially through MetaGov and DAOstar, we'll be kicking off much more efforts to do like years worth of research around this and partner with a lot of groups so that we can actually be making informed decisions and not like, oh, well, they did that, so I do this, and just like purely relative based or instinct gut based things, which generally don't go over as well as we'd want. Every group still has a challenge with how to increase percentage of delegation. I don't have answers. I just think more of us need to collaborate on how. And do we need that, or do you just accept the confines you're in and maximize governance there? It's not necessarily a given that the numbers will keep climbing. There definitely are ceilings. We just don't know them yet. A huge other thing, especially with professional delegates, I mean with everyone, but especially I think with professionals, is conflict of interest disclosure. Right. A lot of the time there will be a backdoor conversation that, hey, I'm a professional delegate in this ecosystem. Let me hit up the grant lead or the governance lead because they know me, convince you of a thing. Oh, I just forgot to mention that the way this plays out, I'm going to walk away with $10 million or something like that. Or I'm already invested in a bunch of companies that are affected by this decision. So I think we need more norms and practices around conflict of interest disclosure, and there need to be clear repercussions, because the first step is going to be clearer ideas, and then we're going to very quickly hit a point where not everyone's doing it, and then we need repercussions, right? If it's known that you have walked away with a lot of money that no one realized because you should have disclosed but you didn't, we need to figure out how to enforce that kind of action. And there's a lot of interesting like legal questions and implications there. I mentioned the ecosystem-specific delegates, and the last thing I'll mention is this like move away from what I call like global voting, right? So this idea of even if you stepped away from one token, one vote, a lot of delegates are still expected to vote on all the things. And so like they're voting globally, right? They're voting on everything. I think there's a lot of protocols that are working towards what I consider like fractured governance surfaces. So you start breaking up the governance surface. Some things you say the foundation is going to handle, and we're not pretending we're fully decentralized. While otherwise it's being like, hey, maybe the people who vote on growth should be different than the people who vote on community, should be different than the people who vote on governance experiments. And it's okay for you to be involved in more, but like pick a lane. Like you only have so much time. Like just pick one thing to go deep on and develop your expertise there, right? We're kind of seeing that with like working groups and councils, but I think there's a lot more both from the norms and the org design perspective that can be improved there. So am I at time, or do I have a time for a question? I'm at time. Cool. So these are, that's my Twitter. If you want to talk to me later, I'll also just be hanging out outside. And those are links to the 2 reports if you missed it. And I will be here. So if you didn't get to do any of that, feel free to just come talk to me. I was told I'm at time. So yeah, if you want to take questions, I'd love to talk right outside. But yeah, thank you. Thank you. This was fun.